Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. I think there are going to be some big contrasts as we head through the next 2 weeks. So there is a lot to cover today, and without further ado, I'm going to begin by taking a look at the view across Europe and the North Atlantic. The animation runs from 18 GMT, Tuesday the 11th. It's very unsettled to begin with. The yellow and orange shading covering large parts of the UK indicates heavy outbreaks of rain. Also notice how closely together the isobars are packed. Strong winds. In fact, they could be disruptive. I'll come back to that in a moment. But running the animation, the outbreaks of rain move away. It's then a showery and still rather windy picture through Thursday and Friday. Another area of low pressure tracks across southern Britain. It brings the potential for further outbreaks of rain, but the details of the path which it takes are still up for grabs. It may go a little bit further south, a little bit further north. Nonetheless, it does look as though a big change will be starting to take place through the weekend. High pressure increasingly influential. As a result, the risk of rain increasingly becomes restricted to the west and the northwest. Into the early part of next week, the same general theme continues. There's a lot of dry weather around. In fact, when this finishes on Wednesday the 19th, it's dry across the United Kingdom, high pressure dominating. What's behind all that? Well, it's the jet stream, the position of it and its strength. At the outset, it's tracking a long way south and it's strong. That's indicated by the yellows, oranges and reds. Running this, that continues to be the case in the short term, but then through the weekend and into the early part of next week, the jet takes a detour northwards, it pays Iceland a visit. That leaves the UK on its warmer southern flank. All change. But in the short term, the focus very much is on the strength of the winds. The two charts here are generated with data from the Met Office UKV model. They showed forecast wind gusts at 11 and 12 GMT on Wednesday the 12th. The highest values generally in southern and western coastal areas, perhaps up to 70 miles an hour in exposed locations. Inland, not so windy, but still across much of southern England, up to around 50 miles per hour, perhaps even a little bit higher in one or two places. It's worth just taking a look at some of the ensemble data. The UK Met Office Morgrapes G ensemble showing forecast wind gusts for a few locations. This graph is for Cardiff. The important thing to remember is that each line represents the forecast from one of the individual runs within the ensemble, so we get a range of solutions. Wind gusts there for Cardiff at the top end around 65 miles an hour, at the lower end around 45, 50 miles an hour. So it's a windy picture. It's just varying according to the individual run. Looking at the picture in Cornwall, if anything, maximum values here a little bit higher, around 70 miles an hour at the top end of the ensemble. Some of the runs keep them down to around 55, 60, but very strong winds nonetheless. Disruptive. Finally, London, not as windy, but still around 50 miles per hour, according to many of the runs in the ensemble. And I suspect if you just go a little bit further outside of central London, some of the values in the individual runs would be a little bit higher. So 55 miles per hour in the home counties, definitely not out of a question. Temperatures through the first week. There are going to be some big changes happening if the computer model data is correct, of course. To begin with, Wednesday the 12th, forecast maximums. It's a chilly picture to be expected with all that cloud and rain around. Single figures really, virtually everywhere, perhaps double figures in East Anglia just. Looking at forecast minimums for 06 GMT on Saturday the 15th, quite chilly still, the potential for some rather cold nights, especially through this period. The frost risk extending right down into southern England. Moving forwards to Saturday afternoon though, and the daytime temperatures are already trending upwards. back into double figures really everywhere, 13s, 14s, 15s, not much difference as you head into Scotland. Forecast minimums for Tuesday, now they aren't as low, the overnight values trending upwards as well. Not particularly warm, of course, but still higher than they were, 5, 6 or 7. They're being shown in southern England as high pressure becomes dominant. In fact, some of the highest overnight lows there in northern Scotland. And looking at forecast maximums again on Tuesday afternoon, by this point, I think we can start to talk about it being quite warm. 16s, 17s, 18s, 19s across much of England and Wales. In fact, the highest values on this particular chart may well be in northeastern Scotland to the east of the mountains there. 21 Celsius being forecast according to the GFS, 70 Fahrenheit in old money. But the big thing to take away from these temperature forecast charts is the upwards trend through the first week after that rather cold start. Also, still that risk of overnight frost for a time, even in the south, but towards the end, everywhere probably becoming milder by night as well. The temperature trend shown by the Mogreps G ensemble for London really backs up that general picture. Disappointing through the first few days, but towards the end there from around the 15th, an increasing number of runs are bringing in much warmer weather, at least compared to what we have early in the week. The 20 Celsius line there. So by the very end, 1 or 2 of the runs are just approaching it in the London area. So fairly consistent, I think, with the theme which the GFS is going for. Rainfall. Days 0 to 5, the aggregate accumulation has been forecast here by the ECM model on the left, the GFS on the right. Rain in all parts of the UK, with the weather coming in from the Atlantic, the highest totals tending to be in the west and the northwest, but significant amounts even in central and eastern counties. But moving forwards to the 0 to 10 day charts, very little change in central and eastern England, so it's pointing towards that drier picture developing between days 5 and days 10. Reasonably good support from the ECM there on the left as well as the GFS. Quite consistent between the two models there. So, in more general terms, how do the deterministic models compare with each other towards the end of the first week? Here is the GFS, Tuesday the 18th. High pressure dominating things around the UK. Similar, the Canadian Global. The German icon, a little different. High pressure centred further north, but it's still influential. The European ECM and the UK Met Office Global both have high pressure being the dominant feature. Good agreement between the deterministics that towards the end of the first week, high pressure will be in the box seat, the main player of the UK's weather, so it should be mostly dry and settled. Also, temperatures are likely to be climbing, particularly through the days. It may well be rather warm by then. Now, does that trend continue as we head through the second week? Here is the 16-day GEFS ensemble plot for London. Air temperatures on the top half. Each of the lines on the graph represent the forecast from one of the individual runs within the ensemble. And remember, these values are for about 1,500 metres above sea level. To start off with, all of the individual runs are above the thick black line, which is the 30-year average, so there's a strong signal for it to be warmer than the norm. Later on, the thick purple line, the ensemble mean, dips downwards, but it remains above the thick black line. All in all, the signal through week 2 is above the average. In terms of rainfall, well, not many spikes there at all through the first few days, but by the end, the number of them starts ticking upwards. But all in all, it does seem to be a drier than average picture through week 2. The 2-metre temperature data table for London, oranges really dominant through the first 4 days there. The light oranges, maximums are between 16 and 20 Celsius. The darker oranges, maximums are between 21 and 25 Celsius. Rather a warm picture being forecast here by the GEFS. Later on, the amount of yellow increases. There's even a little light green. The light green is used to indicate runs going for between 6 and 10 Celsius. Generally, though, through this period, temperatures through the days above the average, significantly so early on. As I say, it could well be feeling pleasantly warm there with maximums into the low 20s. It's not definite, but that's what this data is pointing towards. Up to Manchester, air temperatures very, very similar actually to the ones being shown on the London chart. Likewise, precipitation, just a few more spikes there as we head through the second week. The 2 metre temperature data table for Manchester also, I think, could be summarised as above average. The trend later on is downwards, but through the first few days, lots of orange showing up there, the orange being the dominant colour. Continuing the journey northwestwards up to Glasgow, similar to begin with, virtually all of the runs there, in fact all of them for a time are above the thick black line, the 30-year average. Towards the end, things become more mixed, and that's probably reflected as well in terms of precipitation. Very, very few spikes to start off with, but by around the 23rd of April and the days which follow it, the number of them starts to tick up. So some rain around, but drier than average, I would suggest, through this second week, at least according to this. 2 metre temperatures for Glasgow, lots of yellow and orange to start off with, so above the average. The values, of course, here are lower than they were on the London plot, but as we're heading northwards, the averages themselves are lower. Later on, the green starts to return, light green. There's quite a lot of it towards the very end, but still probably close to average temperatures even towards the very end on this data table. Is the risk of frost still present through the second week? Because I've been talking about the likelihood of it being pleasantly warm through the days, particularly in the southern half of the UK. But could the clear skies allow the nighttime lows to dip? Well, yes, they could, but the frost risk is reducing. The minimums being shown here for Berkhamsted, so I've jumped out of London to escape the urban heat island. Light greens there, minimums are between 6 and 10 Celsius. Later on, there is an increasing amount of dark green. Some of those runs would be cold enough to lead to ground frost, and as you go further north in the UK, the risk is greater. So I think, just to summarise that, we're not completely out of the woods in terms of frost in the southern half of the UK as we go through the second week, but the chance is reducing. It's still greater in the northern half of the country, though. Definitely keep an eye on the details as the time approaches. The mean surface level pressure plot from the GEFS for 10 days ahead, so Friday the 21st of April, indicates that high pressure will be having a good deal of influence. The European ECM, a little bit more clearly defined here, has the high pressure perhaps centred a little bit to the northeast of the UK, but it's always important, as I say with these, not to read too much into them because they are generated simply by averaging out all of the individual runs within the ensemble. In the case of the ECM here, it's got 50 individual perturbations. The mean surface level pressure data table for London, going forwards through time rather than being a static snapshot, points towards high pressure being dominant early on. The trend later is for pressure to begin dipping. The yellow dominant, those are runs going for between 1,011 to 1,025 millibars. So most of them are still above the average, a few a little below it. There's also a bit of green and blue showing up, those runs going for lower pressure. Therefore, through week 2, high pressure being dominant early on, that really ties in quite nicely with the other data which I've been looking at, but uncertainty increases towards the end. Maybe pressure starts to fall. So, to summarise the next 2 weeks, week 1 begins very unsettled. Showers, heavy outbreaks of rain, disruptive winds and chilly conditions. Later on though, the risk of rain increasingly becomes restricted to the northwest and temperatures climb. It may well become quite warm. Week 2, potentially a fine and warm start, especially in the south and the east. Rain more likely in the west of the UK. Towards the end of week 2 though, the chance of wet conditions may start to increase more widely. But that is a long way off, and the ensemble data was not painting a particularly wet picture by any means. So there we have it. Big contrasts in the weather is what I started off by saying. That stormy period right at the start, then the possibility or even probability of it turning a lot drier, temperatures climbing. Will we see 21 Celsius for the first time this year? I'll stick my neck out and say I think we will. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then as ever, I would be really grateful if you could hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Thanks for watching now. Bye.